Alright, 1841. Expect less of this review than even usual for me, in terms of being able to give any kind of informed opinion of what's going on. I made a lot of mistakes in my playthrough, and while I considered restarting after the first round, or even a little bit further in, it didn't make a lot of sense because I knew I'd keep making mistakes, and indeed I did. This is, first of all, a more complex set of rules than most 18xx's have. Some very different ideas in it. It's not as off the board as 1853 is in terms of sort of the mainline concepts that come. It's in the 30 family more closely than in any other, although it does share some interesting, weird aspects. That's okay. It's not so much that it's odd, it's that there's just so many rules and so many little things that are different, that are, and with 8 players, with all the corporations that there are, with the particulars of the components, it was very easy to make mistakes, in addition to whatever the rules had. I can talk a little about the components, since this is a Chris Lawson kit. The components are kind of subpar. You're cutting out of cardstock everything. I would strongly suggest investing in laminating everything. You have to put the little stickers on these before you do that. But yeah, I found the tiles particularly hard to pick up, but I also found the share certificates difficult to manipulate after, without the lamination. Honestly, I'm thinking about trying to change my deep thought order because I probably asked for non-laminated stuff. I kind of want everything laminated now. It was just too much of a pain in the ass. My first thought was, the old AH game didn't have the certificates laminated, but it was printed on a different kind of stock, and that's what's not obvious when you're, ordering these out of the blue or or looking at them, is that, this stuff sticks a little bit more, it's a little harder to handle. I even thought about, it might make sense to laminate the money if you're not using chips, because the money is also kind of difficult. Now this is true in every game because money is usually just paper. Here it's actually a little thicker stock, but it has that same sort of stick togetherness because of the stock, and you end up with I don't know, with something that's difficult to manipulate. Paper money is always difficult for some people to handle. So I've seen games where the money is printed on a much harder stock, and the money is really actually pretty easy to handle in that case, especially with a little slickness to it, etc. So I think laminating the money might be a further option. Of course, you're getting to a pretty high expense when you're starting talking about laminating all these components. And, the game's expensive itself. Another thing is the board, which comes in pieces, and this also I would suggest laminating instead of, the foam core or whatever they build over at Deep Thought. I've seen one of those. They kind of fall apart over time. I've seen more than one of them. I think they're actually not that great an idea. The only problem with laminating these boards is that they come in several parts. So instead of, I don't know, the foam core kind of holds the boards in place a little better. I felt the need to use a piece of plexi on top of it. That worked okay, but it means the game's less transportable. I can't just bring it to someone's house, not that I know anyone anymore. anymore, really. But I can't just bring it to someone's house or to a game club meeting or something without bringing a sheet of plexiglass, which, you know, is significantly harder to transport than this. I also have this little thing, which I didn't try out. It's for a shorter game of 41. I wanted to get the whole experience. Player aid gives you the game phases and all kinds of charts, etc., which it's all present in the rulebook. The charts are actually appendices that are in here. This gives a somewhat more readable and usable version of it. And that's actually one of the problems. When you look at the rulebook, the typeface that's used is horrible. And then when you go to this FAQ, the choice to divide it into rule restatements, which is really, they're saying, I wish this had been combined with clarifications. They're basically just saying, you know, look, this is the exact rule. These are clarifications. They're simply rules that maybe don't stick out as well because of the way it's formatted and everything. But then the clarifications are follow-ups that are in the rules, but maybe you have to work a little harder to find. And then there's the section of changes, variants. The changes, I'm cool with them being changes, and they're probably the best applied here. These others, the restatement and the clarifications, it's really hard to figure out where something is. It's just because, first of all, there's two places where the same kind of thing is present. And secondly, they're all indexed, and so are the changes, as to every rule that they touch upon. Which means if you're looking at a rule you don't understand, it's not trivial to find where it is, because you'll be where some kind of guidance is to understand it better. Because you're looking through really 2 or 3 sections. 2 if it's just in the clarifications or restatements, but if there's something in the changes, then you'll understand, hey, there was a reason they changed this. This rule is vague as it is. Should I take that guidance? This rule doesn't work as written in some way, in their estimation. So what about the game itself? Let's actually work our way through the rules and try to discuss them in after effect. Because otherwise I'll forget things, but that's not always the best way to capture stuff. So for example, there are things like, geez, there are a lot of corporations in this game, and that causes certain issues. For example, the game lasts, as long as the game lasts, you really have an opportunity to start a new corporation. The board itself has information on it that's very interesting in a terrain sort of way. First of all, you have these passes which you have to blast through, and they're fairly expensive, and they end up they count as dots, as sort of semi-cities, but they don't produce any income until you get the 8 train. The actual cities and off-board locations, a couple of them, Milan especially, and then the off-board locations, produce huge incomes, which means you're going to be looking at really, really big runs, even if you're dotted out of places, even if you don't have a big train. And if you're able to set up a really good situation, you're looking at runs that are over 100 a share, which are pretty impressive. All right, let's try to capture what we can from the game. So the first thing in the game is this bidding envelope. And over here in the FAQ, their suggestion in version 2 is to go with a regular auction round. What I went with was the sealed bids, which is reminiscent of 1853, where each player writes down bids on each of the, in this case, only on the minor company, only on the private companies. Well, they're not even private companies in this. They're just concessions. They're not things you own. What they really are is the right to start a corporation. And you basically have to pay a premium to start any of the initial corporations during the first phase of the game. Those corporations, some of them are set up rather nicely, some of them not so much. Your initial bid, you have to bid on at least one of these, but if you cheat, you can have your entire bid thrown out so that you don't have to actually pay money. My feeling at first was, hey, you want to make these bids. I'm not so certain of that, because the players who did well, many of them were investors. The winner started a corporation and actually got 2 of these concessions. But the other couple of players who were in the top ranking ended up not having not having one of these concessions to begin with and not wasting money. It's clear that it's very easy to spend way too much on these concessions. If you don't buy it right away, it's available to the ones that are left are available to you next stock round at $50. So that almost puts if you're paying more than $50 for one, you may be overly optimistic, because there probably will be some left for you to start. And if you don't get one, you have more money to invest in corporations that may do very well. You won't have their presidency for a while, because the guy with the concession always keeps control of the corporation up until a certain phase. I think it's phase 4, when those things go away. Yeah. So there's a level of control that you're allowed by having the concession, and control of a corporation is a very important thing, because you can juggle it around, you can make merging decisions, you can make train purchasing decisions between corporations. But I'm not sure how much of your cash on hand it's worth. You have a fairly limited amount at the beginning to spend on starting a corporation. The less players there are, the more important it probably is, but the easier it'll be to get one for cheap. Okay. So, the core of the game phases, once you enter the regular play of the game and you're out of that initial packet, have some significant differences from other games. First of all, you have a kind of weird set of trains, and they're a little they're expensive. They're not just a little expensive; they're expensive. They start out at $100, which is a little high, and they increase rather rapidly from there, getting up to basically $1,500 for an 8 train. I don't remember what the cheapest of the permanent trains was, but I think it's $800. Which is a high price. The cost of a discounted diesel in 30. But there is more money available in this game. There's a lot of money available in this game because of those big cities, and in particular, if you're near Milan, during the early and mid stages of the game, a swallow can bring you a good handful of cash in. Some of the off-board locations produce well in the mid stage. Most of them boost up to being very valuable only at the end of the game. Speaking of which, the game end conditions, before I get too much into the phases, are kind of interesting on this. So, you've got 3 game end conditions. One is the bank breaking, in which case you play out just the current operating round, which means you're not going to have significantly different scores between games that end that way. When you play 1830, because you play a whole set of operating rounds, if you can time when the bank crashes somehow, you can gain a big advantage by shifting at one operating round, because you don't just get an additional operating round's worth of money, you get 3 whole operating rounds worth of additional money if you do it at the right time. And that all kind of becomes this weird game over in 30. Can I, how important is it for me to push in an extra operating round? Is it worth a swallow? Well, it might be the question of how many operating rounds do I get if I do that? That question's not here. The other 2 ways of ending the game end it immediately after the corporation that did it runs its operating round, which is a huge advantage because you get to run and then nobody else gets to. And those are to hook up the last of the red cities to an onboard city. And the other option is to get your stock value at the highest value. So both of those are kind of nice goals. Players have to usually work together to connect up the last city. And the point is, whoever connects up this, or the last off-board location, whoever connects up the track, whoever lays the track that gives the next person a chance to do that, is really handing them an advantage. Now, it could be your own 2 corporations, in which case the guy who put the third to last is handing you an advantage. So that's something that kind of becomes a sort of a game of chicken. In the game that I played, they handed it to someone who obviously wasn't doing terribly well, but the game ended before he got a chance to take it. Someone who was doing well took that opportunity instead. Back to the game phases. So the game starts off with your, phase 2 trains. Looks pretty standard. The one big difference is on the board there are borders. And in phase 2 you can't even cross these borders. You can't build track across them. So if you're on one side of the border, you can't build track that extends to the other side. You can't build track on the other side of the border. It's possible to hook those borders up, and it's possible to run trains over. You're also limited to a set of corporations which are controlled by those concessions, the historical corporations. That doesn't seem too odd, because when you play, any 18xx game, you're limited to a fairly small set of corporations, and there's 7 of these suckers. There's games that only have 7 corporations, so that seems pretty open. They're all located on the map with initial placements. Now, when you hit the first 3 train, you go up in an 1830 style, green tiles, 2 operating rounds. Corporations can cross the borders now. The non-historicals can be started as long as they're in Italy proper, which is a big deal because a big chunk of northern Italy is Austrian at this point. And major corporations that have multiple bases on the board, multiple tokens, are able to lay track equal to the number of bases they have. Now this is usually just the 2 starting bases they may have. It allows them to connect their track more quickly. But if you start laying tokens early, you're going to get more track lays. And that's an interesting concept. The problem with that is that you're laying tokens early when it's not clear what the map is going to be like. So there's clearly an opportunity cost to playing them early. But if there's key places like Milan, where if you can get a token, you want it. Of course, you can't get one there at the beginning, unless you're the company that starts there. But maybe the gateways to Milan become filled up. Alright, when the 4 train comes out, the 2s die. Some of the borders go away. In particular, Austria shifts down to just Venice. That's probably the most impressive one. But the concessions go away, which means you can start which means you can no longer start, I think, the historical corporations. Not sure about that. I didn't get to that point. Everybody started their corporations with the concessions. And then two of the historical corporations go through a special case. One of them is merged by all the Tuscan corporations. And the other one is the Venetian company, which gets broken up into a Lombard and a Venetian section. And those two, that was the biggest corporation, up till now. That's almost guaranteed in the game. And now it's been split into two smaller corporations, whereas the Tuscan one becomes a kind of powerful corporation depending on how much merges into it. Now that brings the concept of merger to play. What a merger does is it takes two minor corporations. I haven't explained this distinction yet, but basically minor corporations start with less certificates, and they're under somewhat different restrictions, like different train limits, different token limits, and they're almost guaranteed to start with less cash. Anyway, it starts with, it takes two minor corporations and a major corporation and merges them all together. Now the merger mechanism itself, which will apply to all mergers, is when you take two minors, you can merge them together into a major. And they basically just combine their assets, and you get one certificate for every certificate you have in the minor. The minor certificates are worth 20% of the corporation, the majors are worth 10, so you're going to get less income here, but your stock value does not get reduced because the new major corporation is going, well, it might get reduced, but in theory it doesn't. The stock valuation of the new major corporation is going to be the average of the two minors. So basically you're just expanding it into something with more capability for growth. The minors tend to be pretty regional, although there's nothing that specifically restricts them except the dots, whereas the majors can really reach a great deal of the board with what they have for dots, and their train limits and everything allow them more power. So the two minors get merged first, if that's going to happen, and then the minor, and the result of that, which is a major corporation, merges with the other major corporation. Now a major to major conversion is a little different because your stocks are being halved. You have to trade two certificates in to get one of the new corporation. That sounds terrible, except that the stock valuation tries to be kept the same by taking the two values, adding them together, and that basically becomes your new stock value. There's a ceiling to that, though. And that ceiling basically says if you merge two already high-valued corporations, you're going to lose significant stock value off of it. And that was a mistake I made in my play. I allowed that to happen a couple of times. But merging two majors allows you to take two corporations that maybe are limited, again, geographically, and combine them to build one greater route. You don't get more dots, you don't get more train capacity. Is that worthwhile? Maybe. What definitely is worthwhile is if you have responsibility for two major corporations and maybe can only afford one permanent train on them, well, normally that's a screwed situation in an 18XX game. But in this case, you could slam them together and voila, you have, one corporation with a train. Great. That's what you want. You're, again, probably not losing much in the way of stock value. And you are losing some income production because your stocks are reduced. Two shares turns into one, which is the same situation as you get with when you merge two minors. Well, in this particular case, what you're doing is you merge the two minors and then you merge them into the major. And then there's rules for handling if they're not all present. So every situation is detailed out as to whether or not this corporation comes into existence. The other thing that happens is that Venetian line splits into two minor corporations, which is really a horrible situation, especially for the part that owns the richest part of the board, this corporation over here. Now, they will not be allowed to merge across the border until the next level of train is bought. That split is done in such a way that those presidencies are kind of handed out. Now, the Venetian presidency has most of the cash and most of the trains and all the best stuff, but the Lombardy one has Milan as its base, and it has any dots on that side, on the Lombard side of the border, which kind of means that it's got the capability to access the best place on the board. But it may not have a train. And it won't have a lot of cash. It gets like 10% of the cash. So it's just a disaster waiting to happen. Whereas the Venetian one is most of the rolling stock of the other corporation and their capital, but it no longer has the root that it once had. If you end up with both of them, which is quite possible, you can maybe redistribute by selling trains and such. You're always allowed to sell trains. You're allowed to sell concessions, which may include the presidency of the corporation you're selling. And you just negotiate these values at whatever you like. A looseness that's not present in most of the XX games, I'll say. Okay. In the fifth phase, Austria goes away, which means now you can merge the Venetian line back together if you want with Milan. Brown tiles go away. The 3 trains go away. Wow, this is speeding things up. Remember, those trains are expensive and they die early. And we're up to 3 operating rounds. Major corporations are down to only laying 1 tile per turn. And then as we go on, not much changes except for the rusting. The 6 train doesn't kill anything. The 7 train, though, kills the 4 train. And the 8 train kills the 5 train, which is usually permanent. There's also an absolute limit on the number of 8 trains in the game, which means there comes a point where you can't start additional companies because they won't have a train. I mean, you can, but it's terrible. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of the phases of the game. The actual play of your stock round, I don't remember there being too much that was weird here, except that when you start a new corporation, you can put 40% of the share, you can buy 40% of the shares at once. Now, for a minor corporation, that's 1 certificate. For a major corporation, that's 3 certificates. It allows you to make sure that you don't lose control very easily. You're allowed to set the par values all over the place. Like they widely space in the stock market here. They're widely spaced across the board. It's not like the little column where all the prices are kind of clustered together. But there still aren't a lot of options. And what that means is at the early stage, you kind of have a choice between 68 and 100 for your starting values. Because you want to get some certificates out. And most of the corporations start at 68, which is pretty piss poor to tell you the truth. I usually like starting somewhat higher than that in games. I like to put as much money as I can into the corporation and get as many shares as I can. Whatever that formulation is. And then within that, think about, well, am I safe at 67? Am I, you know, or do I really need to go to the next level of stock value because, you know, I only get so much cash in it. The corporations are capitalized as people put money into them. There's no 100% capitalization here. And right away when the corporation gets started, when you buy those first 1 to 4 certificates, really, 1 to 3 certificates, you have to take your money from the corporation that you just threw into it and decide how many dots that corporation is going to have. And the amount you pay per dot depends on where you start the corporation. If it starts kind of close, if it starts on an already built tile, it costs you $200 per dot, which eats up your money like mad. And you probably don't want to buy a lot of dots because of that. On the other hand, if you started out in the middle of nowhere, you got a lot of building to do on your corporation. Dots only cost $25 each, so if you want a corporation with a lot of dots, you kind of started far away. The historical corporations have sort of an advantage here. They generally start on a built location, or a lot of them do. They start in a kind of interesting location for the most part, one dozen, and their dots only cost $50 each. And no one else can start where they do until they've been kind of cleared from the game. So that's kind of some interesting choices there over the course of the game. The historicals, though, have fixed dots. If you start a new major corporation, you're allowed to pick 2 starting cities if it's an ahistorical one. If it's historical, it depends on what it's slated for. Alrighty. You're not allowed to hold more than 60% of a corporation, even if your corporations hold it. And this is one kind of weird. This is probably the weirdest thing in this game. Corporations can hold stock in other corporations. They can't hold their own stock, which bugs me. They can only hold what's in the initial offering. Operating round, you lay track. There's cases where it's pretty much normal, except for, this is something I should have mentioned, there's some really weird track configurations in here. Ones that you can't believe, I ended up not using any of them because they're just not in my mindset, maybe, or whatever. They just aren't what fell into being. But you're able to get track positions that you just can't get anything like it in most XX games. It's got a very, very rich set of track layouts. And that actually kind of makes sense to me. It's always seemed weird that, it's not like that sharp hook coming off, 2 sharp hooks coming off each other isn't possible. It's not, there's a lot of room in those hexes for that to be happening. It's not saying that we're talking about something that's happening in one changing yard or something. The track is very abstracted and very large scale. All right. Like I said, some of the major companies early on get the ability to lay multiple tracks. You can lay 1 token per turn. You've already paid for these, so they're free. You can't pick them back up, though. Nothing too exciting with routes that I remember. One thing that I didn't use at all, that I probably should have, and it's in the things people forget, one corporation can buy a token from another corporation. It just gives them the right to replace that token with their own. But sometimes you have corporations with the wrong, with a token in the wrong place, and you own them both, or whatever. And this way you can change the focus of which corporation has the good territory, as it were. That can be pretty major. I didn't play it, so we don't know how it happened. Then you buy your trains. Now, if forced to buy a train, and that's pretty much by the normal means, things get ugly. If you have the cash on the corporation, you're fine. If you don't have enough cash on the corporation has to sell its stock shares, and it has to sell them at half value. And then if it's owned by another corporation, yes, corporations can own each other, that corporation becomes responsible for it if it's not paid off. And they have to pay their cash and sell their stock shares at half value. There's limits to what can be sold. You can't sell the presidency of the corporations that are currently in trouble. Finally, it goes to the player, and he's under the same. If he's got the cash to cover it, fine. If not, he sells his shares at half the value. You can wipe out your corporation plan here by an ill-advised trade loss if it happens at the wrong time. You can also end up wiping out your own holdings in a very bad way, worse than the usual crashes. Then you're allowed to buy the trade. We check the game phase changes at that point. And now, then your corporation reaches a financial step. It's allowed to sell the stocks that it has. Now, if it's forced in an emergency to sell them, it sells at half price. But if it sells them normally, it can put them into the market at full value, just like a player can sell. By the way, in the emergency sales, you can sell. You're forced to sell your initial offering as well at half price, which again, that's money you were counting on coming into your corporation at full value. I think I'm going to need to switch videos. Alrighty. Battery problem. Okay. I'm on my old camera, so problems are not as big a deal as they are on the new one. So where am I? Then the corporation has really two options. It can either buy a single share, just as a player would, and it's limited to, I think, no more than 5 certificates in its corporate treasury. Or it can start a new corporation, and it can start a corporation the same way a player does. It throws the starting money in the corporation, picks its dots, la la la. Or it can merge. We've gone over the mechanisms of merging, the advantages of merging, and the dangers and everything like that. That's a really complex subject. So one of the big advantages is you compact into one corporation, so you need less trades. You get to change your locality or expand it. One of the more subtle and less obvious advantages, though, is what happens when people have extra shares in a major merge. So in a major merge, if you have 2 shares of the companies that are merging, you can turn that in and you get 1 share of the new corporation. But if you have only 1, you wait until all the pairs are traded in, and then you're offered an option of either paying half the new value of the corporation and your old share to get a new share, so more money goes into the corporate treasury, or, and that sounds fair, the other option, and you may be forced into this if all the new corporation shares are already accounted for, is you can sell your old share, but you get half the value of the new corporation back from the bank. Well, half the value from the bank, first of all, you may have gained or lost money off of this, but that's something that the person starting the new corporation kind of has this neat control over. He's got to have presidency of both corporations, but he doesn't necessarily have a huge holding. In fact, if the merger's done with a historical corporation, while he's got the concession, he may be doing it on 20%, while someone else has the potential presidency up ahead. So you could cost somebody a lot of money by forcing that kind of merger. There's just all kind of weird things that can happen in this game. I think you want to let somebody with the concession hold the corporation well. I don't think you want to have the presidency of a company where somebody else has or the majority shares of a company somebody else has the concession. I think that's just asking for it. So anyway, with the merger, when you turn in a share, if you don't have enough cash to upgrade or to convert, you get the cash from the bank, not from the corporation treasury, which means money's being made out of nowhere here, because the bank is paying you for that share, but the corporation is getting, in essence, that share in its initial offering. And the money from that initial offering will eventually go in. By the way, there is no par value in this game. Initial offering is current stock value, which is why I think corporations should just be able to buy their own shares if they want. And honestly, they should be able to freeze whether or not they're willing to sell stock, but they should have a lot more tools there. But that might make for a much less interesting game, even if it allows you to keep your control that you want. Okay. At the end of the game, you just count your value. No biggie there. There's one other thing that can be done during the operating round, which is minor company that's up against the wall that miners can't cross. There's a point in the stock value here, this yellow zone. Miners can't cross this. And then this blue can't be crossed until the 8 train is up there. But if a miner reaches that edge, they're allowed to then convert into a major corporation. And we didn't have that happen. Oh, I'm sorry. You won't be able to merge while you have a concession. While the concession still exists for a historical corporation, it can't be merged. I hope I didn't cheat with that. Because you also can't convert it from a minor to a major. You end up with a lesser percentage of the corporation. Your shares end up watered down by 50%. That only affects your income. It doesn't affect the stock value, because there's new stock value that's created when you make this change. Again, out of nowhere, sort of. Each person who's a shareholder of the corporation, though, then has an option to buy a new share, a new certificate of the corporation, and the money goes in the company treasury. And then each player has an immediate opportunity to invest in the corporation again, including the people who did it before. So, you're going to get a reasonable amount of cash into it to improve it from a minor to a major. And you end up buying tokens with it. You can buy new tokens up to the major corporation limit of 5 at a fixed value. It's actually only $100 each, which is a pretty good deal, to tell you the truth, at that point in the game. And then you just score it at the end of the game as you would usually. I'm giving my ideas on all the different parts, but I'm having trouble giving an overall view of it. I can tell you my impression, which is really what that would be, I guess. But it's not very... I don't have a lot of faith in any long-term decision until I get more games under my belt of this. So it's up there in all these different decisions, all these different tools that you have to manage and to play with make it very, very interesting to me. I'm in the same position as I was in with 1861, which is this may be the very best 18XX game that I've played. But I haven't played it enough to be sure. You know, there's something clean and violent about 1856 and 1830 that these more cluttered games, it's harder to really say that they're going to stand the test of time. And when I look at 30 or 56, and especially 30, you know, I've played enough of it that I kind of know what's going to happen in the game. With these, what's happening is a surprise, so I've got kind of that exploration wonder that I had when I first faced 30 or 56 for that matter, where it was just like, wow, what's going on? And 2038 too, although that very quickly showed itself not to be too exciting to me. Well, that quickly showed itself to have a flaw that something that I perceive as a flaw that really drags the game out too much. I like that the game ends on the operating round that the bank breaks. I think that's a good move. It's so horrible. I don't mind the machinations to make the game go longer, but it's so horrible to play the game where people are just trying to optimize maybe for $10 on a run, and everybody's got to recount and everything's just hard, and there's lots of dot placement and everything. Those final rounds become just too painful in most games, and to limit the amount of them possible is very pleasant. All the merger and corporate shenanigans that can go on in this game really point to something that looks exciting as hell and much, much freer. It looks like there are more pathways through this game and more pathways that work. All the high value red zones at the end of the game mean that maybe it's not vital to be in a particular location. That all locations work to some extent at least. Stock value has a big effect on the end game on this one. I don't know what else to say. I mean, I really liked it. I need to play it more. That's pretty much it. As I said, this is going to be, you know, less. I take this review with less assurance than most of mine, even towards my opinion of the game, you know, because I haven't played it enough, and there's a lot here to explore.